I never imagined I'd witness the entire HOA board hauled off in handcuffs by the FBI. That's how my story ends. Sounds crazy, right? But here I am, alive to tell you about the night they set my cabin on fire just because I refused to join their membership. How does a so-called community association transform into a reckless, power-hungry group willing to burn someone's home? That's the riddle I'm here to unravel. Before we dive headlong into this wild tale, do me a favor, drop a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from. Ever felt like standing up to something bigger than yourself, only to discover you're in more danger than you ever imagined? Trust me, you're not alone. So buckle up and prepare for a shocking account of manipulation, betrayal, and one scorching twist that changed everything. I jolted awake to the thunderous roar of flames licking the old wooden beams of my cabin's roof. The scorching heat slammed into me and my throat choked on billowing clouds of black smoke. I had never imagined this terrifying moment would become real. My hands trembled on the door handle as I tried to throw it open, desperate for a gulp of fresh air. But something blocked me. No, rather, someone had jammed the door from outside. My mind reeled. Had I locked it incorrectly? Or was this sabotage? If this was sabotage, why? The smell of burning wood suffocated me, and for a moment I wondered if I would end up buried in ashes tonight. That terror was indescribable. But then I gathered my courage, kicked down that stubborn door with all the strength my adrenaline-fueled body could muster, and dove out into the starless night. I should probably pause here to ask you viewers and listeners from across the country, and maybe around the world, how you'd feel in my place. Ever faced a life-or-death crisis like that? Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Sometimes sharing these stories builds a strange kind of communal resilience. Perhaps you've never endured a cabin fire, but maybe you've had that moment when everything you cared about was at risk of disappearing. That sense of alarm binds us all. Anyway, as I sprawled across the damp ground, battered by the fall, I stared in horror at the flames dancing above me. There's something mesmerizing about destruction. The radiant orange glow lit up the pine trees that surrounded my remote property. Shock had me pinned to the dirt, forced to watch as my humble little cabin, my safe haven, was consumed by fire. The hiss and crackle and pop of burning timber became a menacing symphony. The acrid smoke made me wheeze, but I refused to let panic paralyze me any longer. Forcing myself to move, I scrambled up and tried to see if there was any chance to put the flames out. But it was too late. The entire place was practically ablaze. I tried to reach for my phone in my pocket, only to realize that in my desperation, I'd left it inside. In just an instant, I had lost any chance to call for help from out here in the middle of nowhere. Something else occupied my frantic mind. Who would do this? Why me? This property was my quiet corner, a place I'd chosen to isolate myself after a stressful career I hadn't revealed to many. To the handful of acquaintances who even knew I owned this remote cabin, I was nothing more than a hermit. I typically kept to myself, seldom visited the local town, rarely attended gatherings. Strangely, though, the local homeowners association, which encompassed a massive planned neighborhood about 2 miles east, had been pestering me for months. They insisted I pay dues and adhere to their regulations, but my land wasn't technically part of their domain. I'd refused, politely at first and then more assertively. We were at a standoff. Could it be that this standoff had escalated to the point of them orchestrating an arson attack? It sounded so extreme, so unthinkable, yet the more I considered it, the more plausible it became that a handful of power-hungry board members might take out their frustrations in a destructive way. Let's rewind a little, because to understand this fiasco, you'll need to see how bizarre and surreal it all got. I've always been a private individual, but ironically, my privacy became an unexpected weapon once the news broke that I was well, I'll get to that later. First, let me offer some context. I was born and raised on the East Coast, in a boisterous city where suits crowded the sidewalks and people lived in tall apartment buildings stacked on top of each other like anthills. I went to law school. I was good at it. Very good. In fact, I became a prosecutor, the type who terrified criminals at their core. But that's not the side of me I'm proudest of. The job was stressful, the schedule insane. After a notorious case that made headlines nationwide, I found myself at odds with certain criminal elements and even some supposed pillars of the community. Once I had hammered the final nail in the coffin of one particularly influential offender, I noticed how my life and safety were in potential danger. I decided to slip out of the public eye and head west. My father had once inherited a remote piece of land in Montana. As a child, I'd only visited once or twice, but I had fond memories of the emerald pine trees, the crisp wind carrying the scent of wild sage, and the hushed calm that settled after sunset. I never realized how much that had imprinted on me until I found myself craving solitude after my bruising legal battles. So, a year ago, I withdrew into that land, building a modest, comfortable cabin. Nobody bothered me, and I found the peace I needed to nurse my mental wounds. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would a homeowners association even exist that far out in the country? Well, the area around my land had recently become a hotspot for planned developments. Wealthy individuals who wanted scenic getaways or retirement homes started buying up big chunks of property. An entire development, Suncrest Glade, formed around an artificially created lake and scenic vantage points that showcase the mountains. I lived just beyond their official boundary line, or so I believed. That's when they approached me, HOA representatives. They showed up in spiffy SUVs, wore matching polo shirts embroidered with the Suncrest Glade logo, and maintained overly friendly smiles. At first, they insisted that my cabin fell within the expanded district. They claimed that my father had signed some agreement decades ago. They said they had official records that mandated I join. Their membership fees were astronomical, their rules suffocating. My property would be subject to specific guidelines about landscaping, yard ornaments, paint color, roof tiles, fence design, and even how often I was allowed to have visitors for extended stays. I politely refused, explaining that no such agreement existed in any documents I'd seen. I also explained that my father had never mentioned the matter, but these folks didn't take no for an answer. They escalated their requests, eventually sending me letters that threatened potential legal action, but they never quite made good on that threat. Instead, they turned to harassment. I'd find random notices taped to my door about noise violations. Even though I lived alone and rarely made a peep, I'd discover ridiculous complaints about my unkempt yard, though I had a natural woodland environment that didn't exactly need landscaping. The interactions got more and more heated until I finally told them to leave me alone or face a lawsuit. One day, a particular board member named Charles Withers paid me a visit. He was tall, imposing, with steely gray hair and an expression that might have been charming in another lifetime, but had soured into a scowl of self-righteousness. He stated that if I chose to remain an outsider, I would regret it. I watched him stride away with his shoulders squared, as though he owned every inch of land in that county. It was a threat, thinly veiled, but a threat nonetheless. I was so certain that I remained just outside their legal boundaries, so I shrugged it off. In my mind, bullies like that only had power if you played their game. I didn't. What I didn't anticipate was that their bitterness might push them into crossing a line I deemed unthinkable. Had I realized the depth of their obsession, I'd have left months earlier. But I stayed, ignorant of the storm brewing behind the scenes. If only I'd known. Yet here I was, crawling away from a blazing cabin, coughing uncontrollably, with ash clinging to my clothes and grime smeared across my face. I rose to my feet, stumbling through the pine needles. Something bright in the distance caught my attention. Headlights? Part of me thought it might be help, but another part remained suspicious. Adrenaline surged through me. I ducked behind a tall juniper bush, ignoring the prickles. A glossy black SUV rolled up the dusty road leading to the cabin. The headlights illuminated the side of my property, revealing a cluster of men climbing out. The glint in their eyes was haunting, like they'd come to confirm that the job was done. My breath came in tight spurts as I tried to stay hidden. The last thing I needed was to be cornered by a group of arsonists who thought they could get away with murdering me for refusing to pay an HOA fee. They milled around, speaking in hushed voices I couldn't fully make out. One of them, wearing that same embroidered polo I'd seen before, pointed at the flames. Another nodded, a grim satisfaction in his posture. I felt rage simmering in my veins. They'd nearly killed me. They were burning my personal sanctuary, violating every sense of security I had. Maybe they thought I was still inside, perishing in the fire. That's when I realized they genuinely believed the cabin was empty or that I was trapped. If I stayed silent, they might leave soon. Then I'd go to the authorities. The trouble was, the nearest sheriff's station was miles away and I had no phone. But I also had one crucial piece of personal history that made me far from powerless. I was no regular citizen. I was a highly experienced prosecutor, one with a reputation that struck fear in the hearts of criminals. My involvement in the biggest trial of my career had earned me the nickname the Iron Hammer. I'd placed more criminals behind bars than I could remember, relying on my knack for building airtight cases. If these HOA folks had set this fire and attempted to kill me, they'd just picked a fight with the worst possible person. I felt a fierce determination swelling inside me. It took all my self-control not to reveal myself right then, but I knew it would be reckless. I watched from the darkness as the men eventually piled back into their SUV and departed, headlights bobbing away into the night until all that remained was the roar of the fire. My chest felt heavy, and not just because of the smoke. I'd never known anger like that, coupled with a biting betrayal. I had known criminals, sure. I'd prosecuted murderers, drug dealers, mobsters. But this was my home, a place I believed I could finally find peace. These arrogant fools had taken it upon themselves to set my cabin ablaze, presumably because I'd refused to succumb to their petty demands. But they had no idea who I was, or that I had a network of ex-colleagues in powerful places. They'd find out soon enough. I circled around the charred remains, waiting until dawn. The sky turned pale pink, and embers still glowed among the piles of blackened timber that used to be my walls. The air remained bitter with the acrid tang of smoke. My eyes burned. Emotionally drained, I sank to the ground, gazing at the final whiffs of smoke curling up into the morning light. Part of me wanted to cry. This was all that remained of a life I'd tried so hard to rebuild, but tears wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I formulated a plan. Step 1, find a working phone. Step 2, contact the sheriff. Step 3, contact the local fire department's arson division. Step 4, gather evidence. That last part was my forte. If there was anything to collect, I'd gather it meticulously. My training as a prosecutor had taught me that the smallest clue, footprints, residue, accelerants, or suspicious materials, could be the linchpin of a conviction. I walked a few hundred yards to a neighbor I barely knew. The folks who owned that property only visited occasionally. Thankfully, they were present that weekend. After some frantic knocking, the man of the house opened the door, startled to see me covered in ash, reeking of smoke, my clothes tattered. I explained what happened. He let me use his phone, and I called 911. The dispatcher sounded appropriately alarmed when I told her my cabin had burned down under suspicious circumstances. The local sheriff and volunteer firefighters came out, though by that point there wasn't much left to save. The sheriff was a quiet man with watchful eyes, a weathered face that suggested he'd seen a lot of wild things over the years, but even he seemed taken aback by the notion that the HOA might be behind it. He offered a measured response, stating they would investigate thoroughly. He insisted on walking the perimeter, searching for signs of forced entry or an accelerant. Sure enough, they found distinct footprints near the back door and the residue of gasoline-soaked rags. Arson, plain and simple. In the hours that followed, the townspeople started buzzing about the fire. A rumor circulated that the cabin had burned because I was cooking meth or storing fireworks. People love to make up sensational stories when they don't have the facts. The sheriff knew me just well enough to doubt those rumors, but he still needed official statements and evidence. In the meantime, I'd tried to keep my identity as a prosecutor under wraps. Too often, once people learn you're a prosecutor, they either try to buddy up to you or start accusing you of wrongdoing, depending on their experiences with the law. I didn't want that overshadowing the investigation. My immediate priority was to ensure that the real culprits, presumably from the HOA, were held accountable. But as I started piecing things together, little hints began to surface that there was more to this than a simple property dispute. That evening, after I'd found temporary lodging in a small motel near town, I got a phone call. The voice on the other end was raspy, dripping with contempt. "You should have stayed down," the voice hissed. "We have no room for rebellious neighbors. Consider this your final warning." A shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to lash out, but I kept my composure and simply said, "Next time leave a message with your name so I know who to have arrested." There was silence, then the line went dead. I exhaled slowly, my mind racing. These people were unbelievably brazen. They'd tried to kill me and now they were threatening me over the phone? They must have thought I was powerless, just another rural landowner. Little did they know that intimidation tactics were old news to me. I'd stared down menaces far more vicious than them. I'd also built entire cases on phone records, voice identifications, subpoenas to phone companies. If they thought they could hide behind burners, they'd have to be extremely careful. The next morning I called an old friend from the East Coast, a private investigator named Lucy Wu. She was a brilliant detective who had helped me gather evidence in countless trials back in the day. If anyone could sniff out the truth, it would be Lucy. She promised to fly in immediately. By the time she arrived, a fresh wave of intimidation had begun. The motel manager told me a group of strangers had come around, asking if I was staying there. They left a note. It read, "Your time is up. Sign up or suffer worse." My immediate response was to laugh bitterly. Worse than burning down my home? These people were either reckless or unbelievably confident in their influence. Lucy examined the note with a detective's eye, noticing the brand of the stationery matched that used by a local real estate office. It was a small clue, but enough to start digging. Lucy and I spent the next few days gathering details about the Suncrest Glade HOA board. We discovered it was run by a small clique of individuals: Charles Withers, the man who had visited me personally, his wife Gladys, a local developer named Martin Strauss, and a retired judge, Valerie Quinn. That last name surprised me. A judge intimately involved with an HOA? She might have brought an air of legal gravity to their operations. Could that have emboldened them? We also learned that over the past few years, several older landowners in the area had been pressured into joining. Some were threatened with daily fines, forced to comply with landscaping or architectural guidelines that drained their finances. A couple of them had sold out at suspiciously low prices, apparently worn down by relentless harassment. Something smelled rotten. It seemed that behind the facade of maintaining community standards, there was a more sinister motive: prime real estate. People were being pushed out and property was being snatched up at bargain rates. My father's land, my property, had likely been the biggest prize of all. A scenic location near a freshwater stream, perfect for development. If only they could remove me from the equation. Burning down my cabin was a direct step toward that goal. During our investigation, Lucy found something else: a suspicious tangle of financial transactions. Martin Strauss, the developer, had quietly formed a shell company. The property acquisitions from forced-out residents were consistently flipped to that shell company. The involvement of a retired judge only heightened my suspicions. She could have been using her influence to keep any legal trouble at bay. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that the HOA was just a front for an organized ring determined to seize profitable land. Burning my cabin was not just a petty act of revenge. It was part of a methodical plan to drive me away or scare me into submission. That realization ignited a fresh wave of fury. With every piece of new evidence, I could practically feel the old prosecutorial gears churning in my head. I recognized the hallmarks of conspiracy, racketeering, extortion. This was bigger than a single act of arson. Now it was a personal crusade as well as a matter of justice. Lucy and I decided the best course of action was to coordinate with the sheriff and the county prosecutor's office. But the problem was, the retired judge had deep ties to local government. The new county prosecutor, from what I'd heard, was always eager to cultivate alliances with influential figures. I didn't trust that office to remain unbiased. That meant I'd have to be strategic. First, Lucy captured photographs of the burn site. She documented the suspicious footprints, interviewed my neighbor who had seen the SUV's headlights that night, and discreetly took videos of any threatening phone messages I received. She also dug through public records to prove that my land did not, and had never, fallen under the Suncrest Glade boundary. The real punch came when we discovered a forged document claiming to expand the association's limits to include my property. The notary stamp was suspicious, the date incorrect. Lucy's thoroughness was paying off. During that time, the threats escalated. I was followed by a dark sedan whenever I ventured into town. One night I left the motel to get some groceries. When I returned, my motel room door was ajar, the lock splintered. My clothes were strewn around, my suitcase opened, the few personal documents I had left rifled through. They were searching for something. Maybe they thought I had incriminating evidence hidden there. Thankfully, Lucy was out at a nearby diner using the Wi-Fi to send secure emails, so her trove of data wasn't touched. That break-in told me two things. First, they were getting desperate. Second, they were searching for any leverage to neutralize me. They still didn't know who I truly was. But that fact was about to change in a way that would slam them like a freight train. Not long after, I heard from an old contact in the FBI. Years ago, we had collaborated on an organized crime case. I decided to give him a call, explaining that I'd found evidence of possible racketeering in an HOA in Montana. At first, he was skeptical. "That's unusual," he remarked. "HOAs are usually petty about trash cans and paint colors. Racketeering might be a stretch." But once I laid out the suspicious property flips and forced buyouts, my contact sounded intrigued. He asked me to forward any evidence I had. Over the course of a few days, Lucy and I prepared a thorough package, complete with financial records, testimonies, and pictures. We also included a timeline of events leading up to my cabin fire. I made it clear I believed the upper echelon of the HOA board was directly responsible. My FBI contact promised to look into it discreetly. Meanwhile, I couldn't resist a more personal confrontation. Call it my prosecutorial itch. I wanted them to know I was coming for them, so I arranged a meeting with Charles Withers, claiming I had reconsidered and was finally willing to discuss membership terms. I acted humble and beaten down, pretending that the fire had opened my eyes to the harsh realities of living outside the HOA's protection. Lucy was against this plan, but I assured her I'd keep my guard up. Charles had no idea I'd set my phone to record in my pocket, and Lucy was parked nearby with a small camera. We met at a local coffee shop in a private booth. The moment he saw me, he wore a smirk of triumph. He wasted no time letting me know he considered me foolish for resisting them for so long. He said that if I wanted to rebuild, I'd better join up quickly and pay hefty dues, plus fines for non-compliance. My blood boiled, but I kept a stony face. I asked, "What if I don't?" His eyes hardened. He leaned in, tapping the table for emphasis. "I think you already saw what happens to people who stand in the way. An unmistakable threat." My phone caught every syllable. I pressed further, carefully guiding the conversation to see if he'd slip up and mention the night my cabin went up in flames. He wasn't so stupid as to directly confess, but he danced close to the edge, bragging about the association's limitless resources and the fact that he personally oversaw operations that ensure compliance. The arrogance stung. My phone recorded everything. That was enough for me. Before we parted, he tried to extract a huge upfront fee to restate me in the community, which I was never part of. He gave me a printed contract that demanded tens of thousands in membership fees, plus an agreement to abide by a laundry list of rules, including one that forced me to allow periodic property inspections. My signature was supposedly needed by the end of the week, or I wouldn't be welcome. If I refused, I was told there are more drastic measures. How I kept my fury under control, I'm still not entirely sure. but I pulled it off. Later that day, Lucy and I listened to the audio. It was more than enough to prove intimidation and extortion. For good measure, Lucy also snapped photos of Charles handing me that ridiculous contract. We compiled everything into a neat folder. We also found out that the local developer, Martin Strauss, had been lying low since the fire. But once we dug deeper, Lucy discovered multiple shell companies tied to him. It confirmed that the forced sales were swiftly being transferred, sometimes sold off to bigger corporations for triple the price. The retired judge, Valerie Quinn, apparently smoothed over any legal wrinkles with her network of local officials, making sure no one investigated the shady real estate deals too closely. My big break came when the FBI contact called back. He said there was enough initial evidence to open a case. He wanted me to meet with an agent in person to hand over the rest of the files. I felt an immense wave of relief. Until that point, I'd worried about local corruption derailing my efforts. Now, with the feds involved, the HOA's shenanigans would be under far more powerful scrutiny. The hardest part was staying alive and safe until that meeting happened. Lucy insisted we move from the motel to an undisclosed location to avoid further harassment or potential attacks. We ended up renting a small cabin on the other side of the county, far from prying eyes. The property belonged to a friend of Lucy's who was traveling abroad. But the cat was out of the bag. My identity came crashing into the public eye when the local newspaper wrote a story about the burned cabin and the mysterious occupant. A journalist with a nose for headlines recognized my name. I was that notorious prosecutor from back east who had led a high-profile case that ended with a major crime boss behind bars for life. The headline read something like, "Infamous Iron Hammer prosecutor targeted in possible arson." Instantly, word spread. The local news stations wanted interviews. People in town who might have dismissed me as just some outsider began to realize they had a formidable ally in their midst. The HOA, however, realized they'd set fire to the home of a legal bulldog. I can only imagine their panic. They responded with brazen spin. They circulated flyers insisting I was the real threat, that I was unlawfully occupying HOA land and violating community guidelines. The flyers portrayed me as someone who'd bring undesirable attention to their peaceful neighborhood. They even tried to suggest I'd started the fire myself for insurance fraud. Ridiculous. But fear can be a potent tool, and some naive folks in the area believed them. Lucy kept me focused. Stay on track. We'll let the evidence do the talking. She was right. My emotions sometimes threatened to overpower my professionalism, but I had to remain laser-focused on building a case so solid it would bury the HOA's ring of corruption once and for all. I decided to host a small community meeting in a neutral public space, the local library, inviting anyone who'd felt victimized by the HOA. At first, people trickled in, wary, but soon stories poured out. An elderly widow, tears in her eyes, described how they'd fined her for having a certain type of garden fence until she was in debt. A single father explained that they'd threatened to foreclose on his home over some obscure regulation about the color of his siding. Each account painted a chilling picture of a powerful organization that exploited legal loopholes, intimidation, and financial pressure to line its own pockets. Some folks confided that they suspected the board members took a cut from every forced sale. Lucy recorded these testimonials. We promised confidentiality, but many brave souls agreed to let us submit their statements to higher authorities. That night I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just seeking justice for myself. I was championing an entire community that had suffered in silence. Word of the meeting reached the HOA. The next day I received an unmarked envelope containing a single piece of paper, "Drop it or pay in blood." That was all. I stared at that threatening note, my knuckles whitening around the edges. If they thought that would deter me, they clearly didn't know me at all. This was the final straw, the moment that crystallized my resolve. I called the sheriff, who arrived with a couple of deputies, took the letter into evidence, and assured me they were taking it seriously. That same day, Lucy discovered a hidden camera in a tree outside the rental cabin, pointed straight at the front door. We realized we were under surveillance. Clearly, the HOA or their hired goons were keeping tabs on our every move. That turned out to be their biggest mistake. Lucy discreetly collected the camera. We traced its brand and discovered it was purchased in bulk by a security company that regularly worked with, you guessed it, the Suncrest Glade HOA. Another link in the chain of evidence. On a Friday morning, I finally met with 2 FBI agents in a safe location. Lucy and I handed over everything. After hours of questioning and cross-verifying details, the agents seemed convinced we had a rock-solid foundation. They indicated they'd coordinate with federal prosecutors and possibly launch a joint operation. They left me with a sense of guarded optimism. Typically, these cases can take months, sometimes years, to build before they take overt action. However, the arson, threats, and intimidation gave them reason to expedite. People's lives were at stake. I couldn't reveal much more publicly, but I knew the hammer of justice was about to swing. Sure enough, a couple of weeks later, the feds stormed the Suncrest Glade HOA's main office at dawn. I wasn't there to see it personally, but Lucy and I got a call from my FBI contact. He gleefully informed us that Charles Withers, Martin Strauss, and Valerie Quinn were all taken in for questioning. Agents seized computers, financial records, and reams of documents linking the group to fraudulent expansions, extortion schemes, wire fraud, and more. That same morning, local law enforcement, now free to act without fear of political backlash, secured the HOA premises and began collecting statements from residents. I later learned from the sheriff that those men who had visited my cabin the night of the fire were the same enforcers who threatened multiple property owners. They were apparently ex-military types who had turned to shady side jobs. The community was abuzz with relief and shock. Some members of the HOA who had just wanted a nice place to live realized they'd unwittingly been paying into a massive racket. They couldn't believe that a group supposedly dedicated to beautifying the neighborhood had engaged in blatant criminal activities. The board's upper echelon faced an onslaught of charges. I was prepared to be a key witness in the eventual trial, though, ironically, I had never planned on returning to prosecutorial work. But circumstances had thrust me back into that arena. In the weeks that followed, I gave multiple statements to investigators. I provided them the audio of Charles Withers threatening me, the photos Lucy took, the phone records, and the letter that read, "Drop it or pay in blood." With each piece of evidence, I felt a strange mix of anger and satisfaction. Anger at what these people had done, satisfaction that justice was finally catching up to them. Eventually, word reached me that a federal grand jury indicted Charles Withers, Martin Strauss, and Valerie Quinn on multiple counts, ranging from conspiracy to commit arson, extortion, racketeering, wire fraud, and beyond. Bail was set astronomically high. They wouldn't be walking free anytime soon. Those men who had physically set my cabin ablaze were also indicted for arson and attempted murder. The FBI agents found text messages implicating them, discussing making the problem go away at the cabin's location. It was chilling to read how casually they talked about taking my life. They apparently believed no one would suspect the squeaky clean HOA of such a heinous act. They were wrong, spectacularly so. Meanwhile, the actual members of the community came together. The charges against them for violations or fines were dropped. They formed a new residents' committee to handle genuine neighborhood issues, free from the corrupt leadership that had once oppressed them. I was invited to speak at one of their gatherings, which I did, cautiously. After all, I was still the man whose home had been burned down by their organization, but I could see that many of them were victims too, just in a different way. They apologized, empathized, and promised to help rebuild if I so wished. That was touching, though I hadn't decided if I wanted to stay on that land. One crisp autumn morning, with golden leaves fluttering around me, I found myself standing amidst the charred ruins of my old cabin. The scarred earth still bore blackened timbers and half-melted nails that once held my walls together. The smell of smoke had mostly faded, replaced by the clean scent of pine. It felt surreal. All that was left was a battered piece of foundation. However, in that moment I realized something. tragedy could become the seed of renewal. And though they had tried to force me out, I stood there unbroken. Yes, they'd destroyed the structure, but they hadn't destroyed me or my resolve. I'm sure you might be wondering what happened next. Well, the court proceedings took months to unfold, with me testifying and Lucy presenting her investigative findings. The evidence was overwhelming. Charles Withers attempted to portray himself as a misguided caretaker of the community, but the jury wasn't buying it. Martin Strauss tried to paint it as a legitimate business venture gone wrong, though the pattern of intimidation and forged documents begged to differ. Valerie Quinn expressed regret, claiming she never intended for anyone to get hurt. None of it changed the fact that she had provided a legal shield for wide-ranging criminal acts. Ultimately, the verdict was guilty on nearly all counts. They faced lengthy prison sentences, restitution, and massive fines. Justice had been served. People asked me if I felt any sympathy. The truth is, I felt none. They tried to kill me, and they'd made life miserable for dozens of innocent residents just to feed their greed. They had the audacity to put themselves above the law. As a former prosecutor, I'd witnessed plenty of wickedness, but none so brazen as an HOA that thought it could forcibly rule over everyone in a small county. This time, their arrogance led to their downfall. The subsequent headlines declared, "Corrupt HOA ring busted by notorious prosecutor whose cabin was burned." My old nickname, the Iron Hammer, reappeared in the national news. It was strange being thrust back into the spotlight, but at least this time it was for a cause that felt deeply personal. In the end, the county recognized that my father's land had never been part of Suncrest Glade. They officially amended the records to remove any confusion. Neighbors no longer had to fear the monstrous fines or the lurking intimidation. I eventually rebuilt on the same property, albeit on a slightly different patch of land. I made the new cabin bigger and sturdier. Perhaps it was a symbolic nod to my perseverance. The community pitched in, local carpenters, volunteers, even some folks from out of town who heard the story. It was an unexpectedly uplifting experience, seeing how people could unite once the shadow of fear was lifted. You might be asking, so what's the moral of all this? Is it that you should never challenge an HOA? Or that you should always challenge it? Let me tell you what I took from it. When everyday folks come together and push back against corruption, no matter how local or mundane that corruption might appear, justice can and will prevail. Sometimes, evil tries to mask itself behind a veneer of normalcy. It may dress up in polite conversation and official-looking documents, but deep down it's still evil. If we stand firm, gather evidence, build alliances, and invoke the rule of law, we can tear down those deceptive walls. Yes, it can be terrifying. Yes, it might mean risking everything. But truth and justice have a way of shining through the darkest of deeds. That's what I hope you'll take away from my story. As for me, I learned that we're rarely as alone as we think. Even in a remote Montana county, I found people who were willing to fight for what's right. My journey from a quiet, withdrawn hermit to an avenging prosecutor once again was hardly the plan I had in mind. But life has a twisted sense of humor, doesn't it? At least now, as I sit by the fireplace in my newly rebuilt cabin, I can look out at the pine forest, breathe in the crisp air, and feel gratitude that the bullies who tried to burn me out are locked up where they belong. Their downfall was swift, and ironically, they didn't realize they'd targeted a person perfectly equipped to dismantle their scheme. Thank you for sticking with me through this wild tale. If you've watched or read this story to the end, let me know in the comments where you're from and if you've ever had a clash with a corrupt HOA or any group that thought it was above the law. I'm curious to see how many of us have had to stand our ground in ways we never expected. Hopefully, my story encourages you to believe that no matter how powerful someone might seem, they're never beyond the reach of justice. You just have to stay persistent and gather the right allies to stand by your side. Before I wrap up, here's the deep philosophical lesson I've come to appreciate. No matter how isolated we feel, our actions resonate beyond our personal boundaries. When we refuse to yield to corruption, we light a spark that can illuminate the path for others. Standing up for what's right isn't just an individual victory, it's a collective triumph that echoes through communities, inspiring courage and forging bonds that outlast any darkness.